the things that I'm often asked when it comes to the JFK assassination from people who really don't believe that it's a conspiracy, or who might not be convinced 100%, they might say, well, what about a whistleblower? Why didn't someone go to the top and complain and say what they know? And it's a great question, but my answer is always the same. Who were you going to complain to? If you're part of the CIA, and then you realize that the assassination conspirators are at the very top of the organization, well, that makes a very, very low incentive to complain, because you don't know who to trust. And then if you kind of also factor in the possibility that some people that you know are being eliminated or are suffering deaths that cannot really be explained, then it becomes doubly difficult to even consider going to the top to complain. Let's take the case of John Gary Underhill. Underhill graduated Harvard in 1937. He served with distinction in World War II with military intelligence, the Office of Strategic Services, and then matriculated to the CIA. A few hours after the Kennedy assassination, Underhill left Washington and hurried to Long Island, New York, the home of his friends, the Fitzsimmons. There he told Charlene Fitzsimmons the following: "This country is too dangerous for me. I've got to get on a boat. Oswald is a patsy. They set him up and it's too much. The bastards have done something outrageous. They've killed the president. I've been listening and hearing things. I couldn't believe that they'd get away with it, but they did. They've gone mad. They're a bunch of drug runners and gun runners, a real violence group. I know who they are. That's the problem. They know I know." Underhill was found dead in May of 1964. Even though it was ruled a suicide, Underhill was right-handed, and the bullet entered behind his left ear. That's pretty strange. It's a pretty strange suicide. So Underhill's death in May of 1964, just a few short months after the Kennedy assassination, certainly may have served as a warning to other CIA operatives not to come forward with what they knew about the assassination planning. We also have to remember the environment that surrounded the United States just 2 days after the Kennedy assassination. For those of us old enough to remember watching live television, we all watched Jack Ruby actually shoot Lee Oswald in the basement of the Dallas City Jail. Even to someone, a child like me, it seemed at the time that Oswald was being silenced. And I think that also was a very definite and definitive warning to other people that they weren't expected to talk either. And the truth is that there were a lot of witnesses to the assassination that did come forward with their story, but who were not called by the Warren Commission. Primary, what comes to mind is all of the railroad men who saw and heard shots from they saw puffs of smoke and heard shots from the grassy knoll. They all told the FBI, and none of them was called by the Warren Commission. Even Roger Craig and Seymour Weitzman, who were stopped by fake Secret Service agents and also found a gun that was not the Mannlicher Carcano on the 6th floor, but was what they described as a Mauser. They were not believed by the Warren Commission, or they were certainly had pressure put on them to change their stories. And Roger Craig was hounded for many years after that, even though he was a Dallas Police Officer of the Year just a year or two before the JFK assassination. Then there's the example of people like Julia Ann Mercer, who saw someone she described as Jack Ruby letting off two men with a rifle case by the grassy knoll about an hour before the assassination. She had her testimony changed by the Warren Commission. People like national reporter Seth Cantor, he told the Warren Commission that he had a conversation with Jack Ruby at Parkland Hospital right after the assassination, and the Warren Commission said that he must have been mistaken. And they did that with a lot of witnesses. If it didn't follow their script, they either just changed the testimony or they did not include it. We're going to talk a lot about the CIA and why CIA operatives may not have come forward like Gary Underhill right away. But first, let's just think for a moment about Secret Service agents. If you were a member of the Secret Service back in 1963, why wouldn't you have come forward to tell what you knew about the JFK assassination if you had information? Well, think about the Chicago plot 3 weeks earlier, where a four-man hit team was sent to Chicago to assassinate President Kennedy there in a motorcade, overlooking his motorcade route on his way to Soldier Field. Now, if you found out about that and you knew that your chief, James J. Rowley, had bottled up all information about that Chicago plot, you'd have to feel pretty confident that he knew about the conspiracy and was probably a member of it. Why did James Rowley, head of the Secret Service in Washington, not make sure everyone in Dallas 3 weeks later was informed about the Chicago plot, and especially about securing the motorcade route? Further, when Chicago Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden tried to contact the Warren Commission several months later with information about the Chicago plot, he was arrested on false charges. Bolden was placed in jail, keeping him from telling what he knew about the Chicago plot to the public and the Warren Commission. Not one word about the Chicago plot appears in the Warren Commission report. So there wouldn't be a whole lot that you would feel comfortable doing in order to expose what you knew at that point. Now back to the CIA. Let's take a look at what the status of the CIA was in 1963. The truth is, by 1960, the CIA was totally out of control, led by Allen Dulles. Here is CIA Chief Richard Helms admitting the CIA contracted the mob to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Could you tell this committee who the individuals were involving mafia chieftains or organized crime figures?
As far as I'm aware, on that particular situation, it was William K. Harvey who was in touch with John Roselli.
It is likely that at the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro.
I believe it was a hypodermic syringe they'd given him with something called black leaf number 40 in it.
In September 1960, CIA Director Allen Dulles and his Director of Operations Richard Bissell initiated talks with two leading figures of the Mafia, Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana, to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro. Later, other crime bosses such as Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Meyer Lansky became involved in the plot. The CIA offered the Mafia $150,000 to kill Fidel Castro. The advantage of employing the Mafia for this work is that it provided the CIA with a credible cover story. The Mafia were known to be angry with Castro for closing down their profitable brothels and casinos in Cuba. If the assassins were killed or captured, the media would accept that the Mafia were working on their own. The CIA and the Mafia had been working together for years, since World War II, when the CIA was the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to what we know as the Central Intelligence Agency. That was also under Allen Dulles. By the early 1960s, the Chicago mob under Sam Giancana was moving into Dallas. They were running guns to Cuba, to President Batista, and also to the rebels, Fidel Castro. They were playing both sides. Jack Ruby was one of the point men for the Chicago mob in the Dallas area. He was also instructed to be a leader in bringing gambling, prostitution, and other vice to that Dallas community, and that was with the blessing of New Orleans Mafia boss Carlos Marcello, who would be getting a cut of the action in Dallas also. So we have an out-of-control CIA with a point man from the mob, Jack Ruby. No matter what the Warren Commission wanted us to believe about Jack Ruby, he was actually a very valued member of the Chicago mob. That's why he was one of the point men in Dallas. He and David Ferry were actually personally involved in running a lot of the drugs and guns, not only to Cuba, but also other spots in Latin America. If you're having problems believing just how out of control our CIA was at that time, well, just watch this. Here are just some of the operations Dulles created and oversaw. And every one of these overthrows of democratically elected governments installed dictatorships. And they led to thousands to hundreds of thousands of deaths of ordinary citizens. But all of these coups d'etats kept the dictators under CIA control and ensured that Dulles and his wealthy cabal would continue to exploit the wealth and natural resources of each of the countries.
And then they realized, the easy way to get people, how do I want to say, to protect American business investments was to control foreign governments. And in Iran in 1953, the British had come and asked for help because Iran was making noises about nationalizing its oil that Britain was especially dependent on. U.S. was not, but Britain was. And so we worked with them to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran and install the Shah, who became a much hated figure, and the Ayatollah and the fundamentalism that we see in Iran today is a direct reaction to the Shah, who we put in, who is essentially a fascist, who ran the country like a dictator.
Flush with success with the Iran overthrow, the CIA almost immediately decided to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman of Guatemala. The United Fruit Company, in which both Dulles brothers were major stockholders, owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land in Guatemala, along with the railroad system, the telegraph system, and controlled nearly all of the country's trade. When President Arbenz tried to diversify the country's agriculture and provide land for poor peasants, the Dulles brothers led the opposition, under the guise of worrying about a communist threat. The CIA's own website calls the agency's overthrow of President Arbenz one of its most shameful moments. In January of 1961, Allen Dulles ordered the overthrow of popular Congo President Patrice Lumumba, after he tried to stop the raping of his country's natural resources by Belgian and U.S. corporate interests. These corporations held a stranglehold on almost all resources in that country. Lumumba tried to establish a plan to redistribute wealth to poor, small landholders. On November 2, 1963, 3 weeks before Dealey Plaza, Dulles ordered the kidnapping and murder of the Diem brothers in Vietnam against the explicit orders of President Kennedy. Dulles' CIA wrote a fake cable pretending to be from President Kennedy ordering the Diem brothers' murder. Here is famed CIA agent E. Howard Hunt later testifying before a congressional committee about the false cables.
Just that I might be able to improve upon the record.
And what did you understand him to mean when he said to improve upon the record?
To fabricate cables that could substitute for the missing chronological cables.
Did you in fact fabricate cables for the purpose of indicating the relationship of the Kennedy administration and the assassination of Diem?
I did.
Well, let's look at some of the other actions of our unregulated CIA under Director Allen Dulles in the 1950s. The agency began extensive research into mind control with its MK-Ultra program, using U.S. and Canadian test subjects, usually without their knowledge or permission. MK-Ultra tried to manipulate mental states and alter brain functions through the administration of drugs and other chemicals, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and verbal and sexual abuse. Many experiments used the drug LSD. In one series of experiments, subjects were administered LSD for 77 consecutive days. So from 1953 on, we've got a CIA who controls what Americans will read through their Operation Mockingbird, a CIA who is setting their own policy of assassinations and overthrowing democratically elected governments for their own members' monetary and ideologic purposes, a CIA conducting drug and mind control experiments on American citizens without their consent. It just can't get any worse than this. Can it? So we have a CIA under Allen Dulles totally out of control by the early 60s. And we just saw some examples of democracies throughout the world that Dulles' CIA overthrew. In our next video, we'll look more closely at all the potential witnesses that didn't live to be able to come forward to tell what they may have known about the JFK assassination. And that includes 5 top FBI officials who were all killed under suspicious circumstances within 6 months of each other. Thank you so much for watching.